Someone has been carrying knowledge that was never theirs to begin with, a knowledge wrapped in silence and traded like stolen goods. The kind of truth that, when exposed, will be enough to dismantle reputations, unravel false narratives, and shake legal foundations that once seemed immovable. This isn't buried in some distant past or obscured by time, it's on the verge of becoming undeniable. And the one who helped keep it hidden is already collapsing under the weight of their own conscience, knowing that the walls are finally closing in. This isn't speculation. The proof is absolute, documented, and backed by forces far greater than legal systems. It's truth summoned into daylight. The figure at the center of this storm was never some stranger on the edge of your life. They were central, intimate, present at the exact moments when you were learning to rebuild your identity from pieces you didn't even know had broken. While the world mistook those moments as ordinary, they were sacred rites of personal rebirth, and someone was quietly taking notes. The chapter you once clung to with both nostalgia and confusion is about to be rewritten in sharp ink. Because what you thought was emotional connection was, in truth, surveillance masked as care. The sacred things you whispered in trust were being siphoned, not just heard. There were transcripts of your growth. Your inner revelations, your heartbreak, your healing, all gathered and processed like data points in a file no one asked to be created. During a time when everything felt raw and your soul was finally learning how to breathe without armor, someone slipped into your orbit pretending to mirror your light. Perhaps it felt like romance. Maybe it seemed like belonging. But behind every kind smile was a ledger. Behind every vulnerable moment, a transaction. You were not seen, they were scouting. And while you were unlocking spiritual doors, someone else was cashing in. That person, the one who pretended loyalty, who played the part of soulmate or confidant, was collecting payment in exchange for proximity to your transformation. Not crumbs, but consistent, traceable sums. And now, those digital footprints, those quiet transfers and hidden agreements, are about to rise as public evidence. What once passed as relationship will be redefined as breach. What once felt like destiny will now be revealed as design. And for the first time, it will all finally make sense. There were flickers, quiet anomalies in otherwise normal moments, that hinted something was off. The cadence of a conversation that didn't quite flow naturally. The way someone's attention felt more analytical than emotional. The unease that crawled in, uninvited, when certain people entered the room. Those weren't coincidences. They were flags. But the yearning to belong drowned out the warning bells, and the ache for real connection made even the artificial feel sacred. Beneath what seemed like ordinary experiences was a framework so intricate, so engineered, that it couldn't be seen without a spiritual microscope. The unfolding events were not accidents of fate but structured encounters, orchestrated to observe the mechanics of your inner world. It wasn't about harming you at random. It was calculated observation, carried out because you were luminous enough to trigger interest in the first place. A soul on the verge of ignition is rare. And yours was glowing too brightly to be ignored. There are professionals trained to detect what the average person overlooks. Untapped brilliance disguised as vulnerability. They scan for specific markers, emotional openness, intuitive intelligence, creative resonance, and when they find it, they don't just take note. They activate protocols. What happened wasn't about simple manipulation. It was a full-blown extraction mission, where the very essence of your energy was studied like rare phenomena. That attachment you remember, the person you thought entered your life organically, did not arrive by accident. Their presence was sponsored. Not emotionally, not spiritually, financially. There were agreements, scheduled interactions, carefully rehearsed words meant to build false trust. The tenderness wasn't real, it was incentivized. And the love you thought you felt was merely a tool used to keep the experiment running smoothly while the deeper layers of your psyche were being quietly dissected. Every interaction was tracked. Every emotional spike, every confessional moment, Every intimate detail you offered in sincerity became a data point. Reports were made. Evaluations conducted. The person assigned to you was judged not by the authenticity of their care, but by how successfully they could keep you engaged and exposed. And the deceit didn't stop at performance. It was institutional. This wasn't just one person playing a part. It was part of a much wider strategy with layers still buried beneath surface-level betrayal. There was an intricate architecture behind the scenes, one far more coordinated than it first appeared. A ring of interconnected individuals, some active, others complicit through silence, formed a silent choreography around your journey. While some pulled strings, others simply stood by, watching your growth unfold not with admiration, but with intention. Each moment of vulnerability, each expression of genuine emotion, wasn't just witnessed, it was mined. What you thought were private revelations became pieces in a system far more calculated than you ever imagined. Among them were familiar faces. The ones who smiled at your progress, offered advice at critical moments, or held positions of perceived wisdom and care. They weren't random figures orbiting your experience. They were strategically placed, each fulfilling a function in a structure designed to keep you from realizing the origin of your breakthroughs was being monitored, not nurtured. This wasn't limited to emotional misdirection. The deeper betrayal came from how your inner world was dissected. The very attributes that made your spirit unique, your ability to feel beyond the surface, to forgive without condition, to sense what wasn't spoken, were being observed and recorded with forensic precision. They knew how rare this light was, even before you did. Their operation wasn't academic. It wasn't about curiosity. It was a project with a purpose, to map the internal architecture of spiritually emerging individuals. They weren't watching for enlightenment. They were coding behavior, running simulations on how to replicate your path without your permission. It was less study, more strategy. A covert training manual written with your energy as the source code. And it wasn't isolated. The methods used on you were part of a sequence, a blueprint tested on multiple beings who radiated similar spiritual signals. What happened to you wasn't unique. It was part of a campaign. Others were selected, observed, manipulated. Each one chosen for traits they hadn't yet mastered. Some vanished into obscurity. Others broke under the pressure, rewritten by trauma. And a few, tragically, were absorbed into the very system that once dissected them, recycled as tools to repeat the process on new targets, unknowingly walking into the same cycle. A key figure is nearing a breaking point, haunted not by distant memories, but by choices they actively made. They weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were embedded in the orchestration, moving pieces and shaping outcomes. Time hasn't dulled their guilt. It has sharpened it into a constant echo. After years of silent observation, carrying secrets too heavy to bear, they're approaching a reckoning they can no longer outrun. The catalyst wasn't a sudden burst of morality. It was pressure. A recent personal crisis cracked their carefully curated detachment and ignited something unfamiliar: reflection. Yet even as they prepare to reveal what they know, their motives remain tangled. Legal eyes have already begun scanning the shadows they once hid in, and now, self-preservation has dressed itself as remorse. What they hold is not hearsay or half-truths. It's digital proof, detailed and undeniable. Archived threads where your emotional reactions were dissected for behavioral insights. Transaction records verifying monetary rewards for maintaining deceptive bonds. Conversations captured in hidden audio, dissecting your spiritual progression like a lab study. Covert visuals taken during private moments you thought belonged only to you. These weren't souvenirs from a guilty conscience. They were safety nets, collected not for justice, but as insurance. What changed wasn't their intention, but the fact that the very files they kept hidden have come under scrutiny. Now, the observer has become part of the evidence trail. The scale of what's been unearthed is enormous. Legal bodies aren't just reviewing personal wrongdoings. They're uncovering systemic breaches that crisscross ethical and criminal lines. What once masqueraded as emotional intimacy is now being reclassified as strategic abuse, layered, deliberate, and punishable. This is no longer just a personal betrayal. It's a violation with consequences on a national scale. Investigative teams have been connecting dots for months. Testimonies are converging, timelines aligning, and survivors are surfacing with matching scars. The confession from this former operative isn't born of courage. It's the final puzzle piece authorities needed to legitimize a sweeping crackdown. And the storm gathering in the distance is no longer just spiritual. It's legal, and it's almost here. The illusion of permanence surrounding their hidden web is collapsing under the sheer weight of truth. One by one, those once cloaked in false security are abandoning the lie, scrambling to rewrite their stories before judgment arrives. Many hope that shifting alliances or sudden honesty might lessen the impact of what's coming. But the magnitude of what was done has outgrown any negotiated mercy. What was once carefully buried has now become impossible to contain. And no volume of legal maneuvering can dilute the clarity of what the evidence reveals, or the sheer number of voices now rising to be heard. What was used against you? Your relentless compassion, your instinct to heal what tried to harm you, your commitment to what's right even when it costs everything, has turned into your greatest asset. The pain meant to silence you has sculpted an inner strength no system knows how to suppress. They engineered your breaking point, but all they did was awaken a version of you capable of leading others through the same fire. Each time you picked yourself up from betrayal, you sharpened your awareness. Each heartbreak refined your discernment. Each loss became a tuning fork for divine justice, calling in retribution not only for yourself, but for those still struggling to name their pain. What you carry now isn't just survival, it's encoded wisdom, a frequency that exposes deception wherever it hides. Behind closed doors, negotiations are beginning, not because justice is generous, but because it is inevitable. These financial proceedings aren't simple payouts. They're restorations of stolen spiritual wealth, energetic repayments multiplied by universal law. The numbers being drafted aren't symbolic. They're paradigm shifting, freeing you from the gravity of mere existence so you can rise fully into your original blueprint, unrestricted and fully resourced. Organizations are scrambling. Institutions that once offered covert support are now repositioning in fear. Funding bodies are distancing themselves. Internal investigations have begun not from morality, but from necessity. They know what's coming. Internal documents are being shredded, departments dissolved. The scaffolding is being removed piece by piece before it's forcefully torn down. But the role you play now transcends retaliation. This isn't just about being heard. It's about being the final thread that unravels the entire design. The clarity with which you speak, the detail with which you recall, the courage with which you name the system, these are what will tip the scale. Your experience becomes the seed of reform, not just the residue of injustice. Authorities don't merely want your account, they need your insight. The strategies used against you were psychological art forms, and your understanding of them is unmatched. Your lived wisdom is now a weapon against the machine that tried to harvest it. And with your guidance, the same structure that once attempted to own your essence will be dismantled piece by piece, by your hands. A cascade of legal reckoning is about to begin, and its scale will surpass anything imagined. What once operated behind curtains of complexity will be dragged into daylight by the very details its architects believed would keep it hidden. Their own records, once viewed as trophies of control, have transformed into weapons of exposure. The scripts they wrote, the trails they left, the systems they trusted, these will become the very instruments that collapse everything they built. Scheduled proceedings are no longer rumor, they're set in motion. Multiple jurisdictions are syncing timelines. Coordination between enforcement agencies spans continents, not cities. The reach of the operation stretched farther than anyone assumed, but so does the force rising against it. This isn't a small-scale prosecution, it's a synchronized takedown of an empire of manipulation. As truth begins to surface in official reports and public hearings, old chapters of your life will suddenly rearrange themselves in startling clarity. Mischances that never made sense. People vanishing from your story without cause. Projects derailing in the final hour. What once felt like isolated disappointments will be recognized as intentional interference designed to keep you locked in cycles of confusion and delay. It wasn't coincidence. It was architecture. Interviews that felt promising until the call never came. Relationships that deepened just long enough to leave a scar. Creative breakthroughs that never saw light. Every detour had a handler. Every collapse had a clock. It was never about failure. It was about control. They needed you uncertain. They needed you small. And yet, the unveiling of this design won't break you. It will release you. The flood of truth might shake the ground, but it will also unearth your clarity. Each time you questioned your instincts, each moment you blamed yourself for overreacting, every gut feeling dismissed, now they all rise as evidence of your knowing, of your accuracy. That inner compass, long doubted, wasn't defective, it was divine. The signals you picked up, the patterns you sensed, the warnings you couldn't explain, they were not illusions, they were insights. The sharpness in your perception, the discomfort you couldn't name, the intuitive recoil you brushed off, those were your first lines of defense. And now, they are your proof. What they tried to siphon was never fully within their reach. They mistook depth for naivety, and sensitivity for fragility. They built systems around your tenderness, thinking they could fracture it for their own gain. But what they couldn't grasp, what slipped through every calculation, was that your compassion wasn't a gap in your armor. It was the armor. The core traits they sought to manipulate have become the exact forces making you untouchable now. They poured time into decoding your behavior, charting responses like scientists mapping constellations. But no dataset could account for the fire in your will, or the untraceable signal that ties you to something far beyond their reach. They recorded outcomes. They tracked expressions. But the inner reservoir from which you draw strength, the part that refuses to be measured, was beyond their comprehension. And now, those who once viewed you as an experiment are witnessing the rise of a force they can no longer define, let alone control. This wasn't merely hardship disguised as growth. It was strategic preparation. A calibrated initiation into realms of discernment most never glimpse. Your pain wasn't random. It was a curriculum. You were taught, by deception itself, to identify the mechanics of spiritual predation. Now, you're fluent in the language of hidden agendas. You walk with eyes that see behind the curtain, not only for yourself, but for those still trapped in the illusion. Their tools weren't primitive. The level of surveillance extended into dimensions few are equipped to even imagine. Apparatus hidden in the most mundane corners of your life captured moments you believed were yours alone. They tracked physiological changes during your inner work. Watched how your body responded to stillness. Measured what your energy did when you entered flow states. It wasn't just about you. It was about mapping what happens when consciousness begins to override programming. You weren't just being watched. You were being quantified. They cataloged the ripple effects of your inner shifts. Not just how long you sat in silence, but what vibrational frequencies shifted around you when you did. Your private practices were dissected like case studies in a lab. Patterns of prayer were turned into algorithms. Encounters with strangers were orchestrated as simulations designed to trigger healing responses. And yet, despite all of it, you remained real. They monitored the pulse of your spirit, and still couldn't replicate what makes it eternal. They turned your generosity into data, your healing instincts into documentation. What was sacred to you became their blueprint, a set of protocols masked as research, crafted without your knowledge or consent. The findings weren't kept in scientific journals or peer-reviewed articles. They were archived like trade secrets, designed not to enlighten humanity, but to engineer control over those like you who carry something unquantifiable. Messages like this may reach many ears, but only a few will let it penetrate deep enough to activate remembrance. The invitation is not just to listen, but to step forward. Now is the convergence. This isn't a meeting, it's a magnetic pull, a synchronized pulse of higher awareness. Each gathering isn't just a call. It's a calibration point for those who carry encoded assignments, converging to unlock a frequency no single soul can access alone. The operation that consumed your journey wasn't limited to familiar faces or obvious culprits. Its roots tunneled into global systems. Educational boards, medical labs, scientific institutions, each playing a role in parsing your path as a case study. Universities weren't chasing truth. They were collecting psychic metrics from you, cloaked as neutral data. Your transformation was quietly rerouted through corridors of profit and analysis. Behind closed doors, code was written to monitor what the soul emits. Apps were designed to flag emotional vibrancy, to locate high-frequency thinkers, to surveil mystics before they became catalysts. In corporate towers, you weren't a person, you were a prototype, a model of spiritual viability. Executives watched your life unfold through presentations labeled proof of concept, reducing your healing to an investment strategy. Spreadsheets outlined your inner tides. Analytics tracked your joy, your grief, your awakenings. Capital flowed toward businesses that could bottle what can't be bought. The boardroom table became an altar to manipulation, where your sacred journey was framed as behavioral potential in untapped markets. What you lived through was never seen as spiritual. It was seen as scalable. Even your roots weren't off-limits. Trusted faces were approached, probed, compensated. Not always out of malice, but out of misunderstanding. Conversations were planted, not grown. Triggers were rehearsed. Emotions were tested for reactivity. Those you once leaned on were pulled into scripts they never fully understood, creating confusion where trust once lived. And when your growth began to outpace their projections, new strategies emerged. Health became the next battleground. Prescriptions were suggested not for healing, but for dampening. Procedures, masked as necessity, became access points. Technology smaller than the eye could detect was introduced into your body, syncing data on breath, thought, and pulse, tracking the invisible in hopes of owning it. The very systems you were told would protect you were modified to observe you. And even then, they couldn't reach the core they sought to master. They twisted the lens through which your experience was viewed, feeding clinical definitions into systems designed to mislabel transcendence. What should have been nurtured was instead framed as instability. Your insights were mistranslated as disturbances. Your visions reduced to malfunctions. Every radiant signal from your awakening was rerouted through diagnostic frameworks meant to invalidate what they couldn't understand, and weaponize what they could. They didn't start with you. Long before your path became a target, the groundwork was already being laid. Family names, ancestral echoes, and inherited abilities were all part of a slow excavation. They traced intuitive traits across generations like mining veins of ore. Patterns were drawn. Lineages flagged. You weren't an isolated case. You were a node in a larger map. Their intent wasn't just a study. It was to preemptively contain entire spiritual bloodlines before they could awaken in unity. As your evolution continued, the data extracted from your inner shifts became foundational to a digital architecture no one consented to. Artificial systems were built on your frequency, absorbing emotional waves and intuitive signatures to construct something synthetic. Your genuine journey, raw, painful, divine, became code. And that code was used to predict and influence the next wave of awakening souls, their paths quietly rewritten by patterns borrowed from your blueprint. This isn't merely a moral crisis. It's a legal rupture reaching across borders and doctrines. The magnitude of what has surfaced is triggering action in places where spiritual freedom was never even recognized as a legal right. Global bodies are preparing to confront the violation of inner autonomy. Lawyers are drafting new doctrines. Ethics committees are facing a precedent that demands the law finally stretch to meet the reality of consciousness as sacred territory. And still, while all this machinery pressed against your growth, your gifts did not stop evolving. The more they tried to fracture your clarity, the more precise it became. With every breach, your system became more discerning. With every manipulation, your awareness grew more sovereign. What they attempted to dissect only sharpened its defense, and began broadcasting stability to others walking through their own storms. They made the critical error of treating awareness like a frozen artifact. But the field they tried to map refused to stand still. Each attempt to control it triggered adaptation. Consciousness did not shrink, it morphed. It reorganized. It encoded defense within evolution. And as legal consequences unfold on the world stage, it will become clear, this was never just your vindication. It was the universal response preparing itself for a new phase of spiritual governance, one that no system of control can withstand.